The first gunshot rang through the dusty streets of Promise Creek, Montana Territory, 1882, making Clara Zimmerman duck behind a water trough as she clutched her market basket. She hadn't expected violence on her weekly trip to town, but in the 3 years since she'd been widowed, she'd learned to expect the unexpected. "Get back inside." Sheriff Patterson's voice boomed as townsfolk scattered. Clara peered over the trough's edge. 2 men faced each other in the street, one a local troublemaker, the other a stranger with shoulders as wide as a door frame, and a stance that suggested he wouldn't be the one lying in the dirt when this was over. "You calling me a cheat?" the local man slurred, his gun wavering. The stranger's voice carried clearly across the distance. "I'm calling you drunk and foolish. Put that gun down before you hurt someone." Clara held her breath. The stranger hadn't even drawn his weapon, which hung in a worn holster at his hip. His confidence was either admirable or foolhardy. The drunk fired again, wildly. A window shattered in the mercantile behind the stranger, who didn't flinch. In a blur of movement too quick for Clara to follow, the stranger finally drew. One shot rang out and the local's gun went spinning from his hand. "Next one won't be so considerate," the stranger said, his voice level. Sheriff Patterson stepped out then, relieving the drunk of his duties to remain vertical by clapping him in irons. "Much obliged, Mr. Xavier," the sheriff said. "Been meaning to have a word with Dawson here about his drinking." The stranger Xavier nodded once and holstered his weapon with practiced ease. As the crowd dispersed, Clara found herself still staring at him. Tall and lean, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a face weathered by sun and wind. When he turned, his eyes met hers across the distance, and Clara felt a jolt of something she hadn't experienced in years. She quickly looked away, gathering her basket and standing. This was no time for foolishness. At 32, with a failing homestead and a reputation as barren as her womb, Clara had no business noticing strangers, no matter how capable they seemed. As she hurried toward the mercantile to complete her errands, she heard whispers following her. Poor Clara Zimmerman, 3 years since George died and still alone. Not like she'd find another husband anyway. What man wants a wife who can't give him children, dust and weeds? That's all she's growing on that claim of hers. Clara kept her chin high, though each word stung like a lash. The townsfolk had labeled her barren long before George's death, when 7 years of marriage had produced no children. After pneumonia took him, leaving her with a homestead she could barely maintain, they'd added dust to her collection of unwanted titles. Inside the mercantile, Clara approached the counter where Arthur Jenkins stood tallying accounts. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," she said, placing her small list before him. "I'll need these supplies, please." Jenkins adjusted his spectacles, glancing over her list. "Flour, coffee, sugar." "Not much here, Mrs. Zimmerman." "It's what I need," she replied simply, knowing it was all she could afford. As Jenkins gathered her items, the bell above the door jingled. Clara didn't need to turn to know who had entered. The sudden hushed whispers among the other customers told her. She kept her eyes fixed on Jenkins as he measured coffee beans. "Afternoon," came a deep voice beside her. "I'll need supplies for a month or so, riding up to the Northern Territory." Clara allowed herself a sideways glance. The stranger Xavier stood less than an arm's length away, his hat now in his hands, revealing dark hair with hints of silver at the temples. Up close, she could see his eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "New in town?" Jenkins asked, abandoning Clara's order to attend to the newcomer. "Passing through," Xavier replied. "Name's Ryan Xavier." "Well, Mr. Xavier, we sure appreciate how you handled Dawson. Man's been a menace since his wife left." Ryan nodded, then glanced at Clara. "Madam," he acknowledged with a slight bow of his head. Mr. Xavier, she replied stiffly, uncomfortable with his attention. Jenkins seemed to remember Clara then. "Oh, Mrs. Zimmerman, about your account. I'm afraid I can't extend any more credit. You're already 3 months behind." Heat flooded Clara's face as every eye in the store turned toward her. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll take what I can pay for today." She counted out coins from her small purse, aware of the pitying glances directed her way. When Jenkins handed over her meager purchases, she tucked them into her basket and turned to leave. "Excuse me, madam," Ryan Xavier's voice stopped her. "I understand there's a room for rent above the saloon, but I prefer quieter accommodations. Would you know of any other options in town?" Clara hesitated. She knew what he was really asking, whether she took in boarders, like many widows did to make ends meet. She'd considered it many times but feared the gossip it would create. "The widow Peterson has a clean room," she replied, 3 doors down from the church. Ryan nodded his thanks, and Clara hurried out, eager to escape the stifling atmosphere of curiosity and pity. She was halfway to her wagon when she heard footsteps behind her. "Mrs. Zimmerman," Ryan called, catching up easily with his long stride. "I don't mean to impose, but I noticed your wagon wheels got a split forming in the rim." Clara stopped, surprised. She'd noticed the wheel's deterioration but had hoped it would hold until she could afford repairs. "I'm aware," she said stiffly. "I'm handy with woodworking," he offered. "Could fix it before it strands you somewhere between here and your place." Clara studied him, suspicion warring with practical need. "Why would you offer that?" Ryan shrugged. "Just being neighborly." "We're not neighbors, Mr. Xavier." A smile touched his lips, transforming his weathered face. "Not yet, maybe." Clara felt an unwelcome warmth spreading through her chest. "I don't need charity. Never thought you did, but everyone needs a hand sometimes." He gestured to her wagon. "How far out are you?" 5 miles east, she answered reluctantly. "I could come by tomorrow, fix that wheel proper. Would only take an hour or so." Clara should have refused. The last thing she needed was a man at her homestead stirring up more gossip. But the truth was, she couldn't afford for that wheel to break. "Very well," she finally said. "Tomorrow morning." Ryan nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "I'll be there." As Clara climbed onto her wagon seat, she couldn't help wondering what she'd just agreed to. Ryan Xavier seemed decent enough, but experience had taught her that people's motivations were rarely as simple as they appeared. The ride home gave Clara plenty of time to second-guess her decision. Her homestead came into view. As the sun began its descent, a small cabin with a vegetable garden, a chicken coop, and fields that had once held promise but now struggled against drought and her limited ability to work them alone. After tending to her horse and chickens, Clara entered her cabin and looked around with fresh eyes, imagining how it might appear to a stranger. Though simple, it was clean and orderly. The furniture George had built still stood sturdy, and the quilt on her bed added a touch of color to the otherwise practical space. That night, as she lay in bed, Clara found her thoughts returning to Ryan Xavier. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, not pity, as she saw in most people's gazes, but something like respect. Foolishness, she told herself firmly. The man was passing through. Tomorrow he would fix her wheel, and that would be the end of it. Morning brought clear skies and the distant sound of hoofbeats as Clara finished hanging laundry. She smoothed her work dress and checked that her hair was properly pinned, then silently chided herself for caring about her appearance. Ryan arrived on a sorrel gelding, tools strapped behind his saddle. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. "Morning, Mrs. Zimmerman," he called, removing his hat. "Mr. Xavier," she acknowledged, approaching cautiously. You found the place easily enough. Hard to miss the only homestead with flowers growing by the door, he replied, nodding toward the wild roses she'd transplanted from the creek bank. Clara hadn't expected him to notice such a detail. The wheel's over there, she said, gesturing to where she'd removed it the previous evening. I can offer you coffee while you work. That would be welcome, Ryan said, already examining the damaged wheel. This shouldn't take long to fix. Good solid wood just needs reinforcing. As Clara prepared coffee, she watched through the window as Ryan set to work with practiced efficiency. His movements were deliberate, his focus complete. When she brought the coffee out, he accepted it with a grateful nod. You've kept this place up well, he commented, taking a sip. Not easy to do alone. I manage, Clara replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Your husband been gone long? Ryan asked, returning to his work on the wheel. 3 years this past winter, Clara answered. Pneumonia. Ryan nodded, his expression somber. Hard country for those who take ill. It is, she agreed. After a moment's hesitation, she asked, What brings you to Promise Creek, Mr. Xavier? You said you're heading north. Looking for good grazing land, he explained, fitting a piece of wood to reinforce the wheel's rim. Spent the last 15 years working other men's ranches. Time to stake my own claim. Alone? The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. Ryan's blue eyes met hers. For now, he said simply. Clara looked away first, busying herself with gathering eggs while he worked. She'd nearly forgotten how it felt to have a man's presence around the homestead, the sound of tools, the quiet competence, the sense of not carrying every burden alone. An hour later, Ryan had the wheel repaired and back on her wagon. That should hold better than new, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. What do I owe you? Clara asked, prepared to pay what she could, though it wouldn't be much. Ryan shook his head. Nothing. But I wouldn't say no to a meal before I head back to town. Been living on saloon fare for 3 days now. Clara hesitated only briefly. I have stew from yesterday that could be heated. Over the simple meal, Ryan asked about the area water sources, soil quality, winters. Clara found herself speaking more than she had in months, sharing knowledge of the land she'd gained through hard experience. The creek that runs along the north edge of your property, Ryan said, does it flow year-round? Even in the driest summers, Clara confirmed. Though it narrows to not much more than a trickle, it's why George chose this land. Ryan nodded thoughtfully. Good water's worth more than gold out here. As he prepared to leave, Ryan hesitated by his horse. Mrs. Zimmerman, I noticed your north field lying fallow. Clara stiffened. I can't work all the land alone. No, few can, he agreed easily. I was thinking I'll be in town a while looking at properties. If you'd consider a fair arrangement, I could help get that field planted, split the harvest. Clara stared at him, suspicion rising again. Why would you offer that? Because I need to eat this winter same as you, Ryan replied with a hint of a smile. And because good land shouldn't go to waste. Clara crossed her arms. The townsfolk would talk. They'll talk regardless, Ryan pointed out. Question is whether you'll have a crop come fall. He was right, and they both knew it. Clara's stores from last year's harvest were dwindling, and the small field she'd managed to plant wouldn't yield enough to see her through another winter. I'll consider it, she finally said. Ryan nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. I'll be at the Widow Peterson's if you decide. He mounted his horse with fluid ease. Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Zimmerman. As she watched him ride away, Clara felt an unfamiliar tension in her chest. Ryan Xavier was offering a practical solution to a real problem. Yet accepting his help felt like acknowledging a failure on her part, admission that she couldn't maintain the homestead George had been so proud of. That evening, Clara sat on her porch, watching shadows lengthen across land that had once held such promise. The truth was inescapable. Without help, she might lose everything before winter's end. 3 days later, Clara drove her wagon into town with a decision made. She found Ryan exiting the land office, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Xavier," she called, drawing his attention. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he replied, approaching her wagon. "How's that wheel holding up?" "Perfectly," she acknowledged. "I've considered your offer about the north field." Interest sparked in his eyes. "And I accept with conditions," Clara stated firmly. "You'll work daylight hours only. You'll take 1/3 of the harvest, not half, and you'll understand this is a business arrangement, nothing more." Ryan's lips quirked in a barely suppressed smile. "Those terms seem fair enough, Mrs. Zimmerman." "Clara," she corrected him impulsively. "If we're to work together, you might as well use my given name." "Clara," he repeated, the words sounding different in his deep voice. "And I'm Ryan." They shook hands to seal the agreement, and Clara ignored the warmth of his calloused palm against hers. "I'll come out tomorrow to assess what needs doing," Ryan said. "Planting season's already upon us." As Clara gathered her supplies from the mercantile, she felt Jenkins' curious gaze. "Heard you and Mr. Xavier struck some kind of arrangement," he ventured, wrapping her purchases. News traveled fast in Promise Creek. "He's helping with the north field," Clara replied neutrally. "A business arrangement." Jenkins nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. "Man seems capable enough. Been asking all over town about the best grazing lands." "Has he found anything suitable?" Clara asked, trying to sound merely conversational. "Not yet," Jenkins replied. "Says everything worth having is already claimed." The information settled uneasily in Clara's mind as she drove home. If Ryan couldn't find land to purchase, would he move on once their arrangement ended? The thought brought an unexpected pang of disappointment. The next morning, Ryan arrived leading a plow horse beside his gelding. "Borrowed from the livery," he explained. "Owner owed me a favor." Together they walked the north field, Ryan examining the soil, Clara pointing out the boundaries. The easy competence with which he assessed the land reminded Clara of George in those early days of hope. "Good soil," Ryan commented, crumbling dirt between his fingers. "Needs turning, but it'll yield well with some work." For the next 2 weeks, Clara adjusted to the new rhythm of her days. Each morning, Ryan would arrive as the sun rose, tipping his hat in greeting before setting to work in the field. Clara continued her own chores, tending chickens, working her vegetable garden, mending and cleaning. Occasionally their paths would cross during the day. Ryan would stop for water, or Clara would bring lunch to the field's edge. Their conversations, initially stilted and practical, gradually eased into something more comfortable. "Where did you learn farming?" Clara asked one noon as Ryan ate the simple meal she'd brought. "You said you worked ranches." "Grew up on a farm in Missouri," Ryan replied, wiping his mouth with a bandana. "5 brothers, 2 sisters. Pa insisted we all learn every aspect of working the land before we learned anything else." "A large family," Clara observed, the familiar ache of her own childlessness surfacing briefly. Ryan nodded. "Too many mouths to feed on too little land. We scattered when we grew up. 2 brothers went west to California, one's in Colorado. Haven't seen my sisters in years, both married and moved east with their husbands." "You miss them," Clara said, recognizing the shadow that crossed his face. "Some days," he admitted. "But a man makes his own way out here." As April turned to May, the north field was plowed, planted, and beginning to show the first green shoots of what would become wheat. Ryan had worked tirelessly, often continuing past the agreed-upon hours despite Clara's protests. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Clara found Ryan still in the field, checking irrigation channels he'd dug to direct water from the creek. "You're working too hard," she called as she approached. Ryan straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Work needs doing." "Not at the expense of your health," Clara insisted. "You've been here since dawn." He smiled then, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Worried about me, Clara?" She felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Worried about my wheat," she corrected primly, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Ryan chuckled, gathering his tools. "Fair enough. I'll head back to town." Clara hesitated, then said, "I've made stew enough for two." "You might as well eat before you go." If Ryan was surprised by the invitation, he didn't show it. "Much obliged," he said simply. Over dinner in Clara's small cabin, with lamplight casting a warm glow, the atmosphere between them shifted subtly. For the first time, they weren't employer and hired hand, widow and stranger, but simply a man and woman sharing a meal at day's end. "Tell me about your husband," Ryan said as they finished eating. "If you don't mind speaking of him." Clara's hand stilled on her plate. Few people asked about George anymore. It was as though his memory had faded from Promise Creek along with his physical presence. "George was a dreamer," she said softly. "Saw possibilities where others saw only hardship. When we claimed this land, everyone said it was too far from town, too wild. But George saw good soil, clean water, a place to build a life." Ryan listened without interrupting, his blue eyes intent on her face. "He worked himself to exhaustion those first years," Clara continued, "building the cabin, clearing fields, digging the well. Always talking about what we'd have someday. Someday we'd have a bigger house. Someday we'd have cattle instead of just chickens someday." She trailed off, remembering George's enthusiasm, his unflagging belief that prosperity lay just around the corner. "And then," Ryan prompted gently. "And then he caught pneumonia in his third winter," Clara said, the familiar grief muted now by time. "Coughed for weeks. By the time I got the doctor out from town, there was nothing to be done." Ryan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," Clara agreed. "Stubborn, sometimes foolhardy, but good-hearted." After a moment, she asked, "Have you ever been married, Ryan?" He shook his head. "Came close once back in Missouri, Hannah Williams. We'd been sweethearts since childhood. What happened? I asked her to come west with me. She said she couldn't leave her family," Ryan explained simply. "Can't blame her. Life out here isn't what most women dream of." "Some of us manage," Clara said with a hint of defensiveness. Ryan's gaze met hers across the table. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Some do." The moment stretched between them, filled with something Clara wasn't ready to name. She stood abruptly, gathering dishes. "It's getting late. You should head back to town before it's fully dark." Ryan accepted her dismissal without comment, thanking her for the meal and taking his leave. As Clara watched him ride away, she pressed a hand to her chest, willing her racing heart to steady. This wasn't part of their arrangement, this awareness of him as a man, this fluttering beneath her ribs when he looked at her with those blue eyes. Clara had spent 3 years building walls around her heart, 3 years convincing herself that being alone was preferable to risking loss again. Yet each day, Ryan's presence chipped away at those walls, leaving her feeling both vulnerable and alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. As spring progressed into early summer, rumors began circulating through Promise Creek. Ryan Xavier wasn't just passing through, he was negotiating to buy the old Matthews place, 5 miles north of town. The property had been abandoned for 2 years after drought and debts had driven the family back east. Clara heard the gossip when she went to town for supplies, but Ryan hadn't mentioned any such plans to her. Their working relationship had settled into a comfortable pattern. He arrived each morning, worked the field, sometimes shared a midday meal with her, and returned to town by nightfall. They spoke of many things during those brief interactions: books they'd read, places they'd seen, opinions on everything from politics to the proper way to predict weather. But neither mentioned the future beyond the coming harvest. One afternoon in late June, Clara found Ryan mending a fence at the edge of the property, a task that wasn't part of their agreement. "You don't need to do that," she said, approaching with a jug of water. Ryan accepted the drink gratefully. "Noticed it was down when I rode in this morning. Didn't want your chickens wandering onto the road." Clara studied him as he worked, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscled forearms bronzed by the sun. "I heard you're buying the Matthews place," she said finally. Ryan's hands paused briefly before continuing to secure a fence post. "News travels fast." "Is it true?" He straightened, meeting her gaze. "Yes, papers should be finalized next week." Clara nodded, uncertain why the confirmation left her feeling hollow. "Congratulations. It's good land with the right attention." "That's what I'm counting on," Ryan replied. After a moment he added, "It's only 3 miles from here as the crow flies." The implication hung in the air between them that their paths wouldn't necessarily diverge once the harvest was complete. Clara wasn't sure whether to be relieved or alarmed by the prospect. "Will you build right away?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "A basic shelter before winter," Ryan confirmed. "Proper house can wait till next year. Need to focus on getting livestock first." Clara nodded, practical concerns crowding out emotional ones. "You'll need help. Building, I mean." "Hoping to hire some men from town," Ryan said. "And I'm not above accepting neighborly assistance, if offered." His gaze held hers, and Clara realized he was extending an invitation of sorts to continue whatever this was between them, beyond the boundaries of their current arrangement. "Neighbors should help neighbors," she agreed carefully. "That's how we all survive out here." Ryan's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Indeed," he said, turning back to the fence. 3 days later, disaster struck. Clara was hanging laundry when she noticed storm clouds gathering on the horizon. By midday, the sky had darkened ominously, the air heavy with impending rain. Ryan arrived as usual but immediately noted the approaching storm. "This looks bad," he said, dismounting quickly. "We need to secure everything." Together they worked frantically, bringing in the chickens, storing tools, reinforcing the lean to where Clara kept firewood. The wind picked up as they finished, whipping Clara's skirts and tearing at Ryan's hat. "You should head back to town," Clara urged, raising her voice over the growing howl of the wind. Ryan shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving you alone in this." Before Clara could argue, the first fat droplets of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it transformed into a deluge. They rushed into the cabin, soaked despite their haste. "I've never seen a storm come on so quickly," Clara said, pushing wet hair from her face. Ryan moved to the window, his expression grim as he watched torrents of water cascade from the sky. "Flash flood risk," he said tersely. The creek could overflow. Clara's heart sank. The creek that had been such a blessing could become a curse if it breached its banks. The north field, their field, lay directly in its potential path. For hours, they could only wait as the storm raged. Wind rattled the cabin shutters, and rain drummed relentlessly on the roof. Clara paced anxiously while Ryan stoked the fire, his presence both comforting and disconcerting in the intimate confines of her home. "The field will be fine," he assured her, though his eyes betrayed his own concern. "We dug those irrigation channels deep. They'll help direct water away from the plantings." Clara nodded, wanting to believe him. "George lost an entire season's crop to flooding our first year," she said quietly. "We nearly starved that winter." Ryan moved closer, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "That won't happen again," he promised. "Whatever comes, you won't face it alone." The simple touch, the earnest words, something broke loose in Clara then, a dam of emotion she'd held back for too long. She turned into his embrace without conscious thought, her face pressing against his chest as his arms encircled her. "I'm so tired of being alone," she whispered, the confession torn from her by the storm's fury and the unexpected safety of his arms. Ryan's hand came up to stroke her hair, still damp from the rain. "I know," he murmured. "Believe me, I know." When Clara tilted her face up to look at him, she found his blue eyes dark with an emotion that mirrored her own longing. The kiss that followed seemed inevitable, gentle at first, then deepening as 3 years of solitude and weeks of growing attraction culminated in this moment. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but within the cabin's walls, Clara rediscovered feelings she'd thought buried with her husband. Ryan's touch was reverent, his lips tracing paths that awakened her body from a long slumber. "Clara," he breathed against her neck, her name a question and a plea. "Yes," she answered, leading him toward the bed that had been cold and empty for too long. In the storm's aftermath, they lay entwined beneath quilts, the rain now a gentle patter on the roof. Ryan's fingers traced lazy patterns on Clara's bare shoulder as she rested her head on his chest. "I never expected this," she admitted softly. "When you offered to help with the field, I never thought." "Nor did I," Ryan confessed. "Thought I'd help a neighbor earn some grain for winter. Didn't plan on falling in love with the neighbor." Clara's breath caught at the word love, so easily spoken. She pushed herself up to look into his face. "Is that what this is?" Ryan met her gaze steadily. "For me, yes, has been for weeks now." A tangle of emotions washed through Clara: joy, fear, guilt. "I loved George," she said, needing him to understand. "I know you did," Ryan replied without hesitation. "Loving him doesn't mean you can't love again." Clara laid her head back on his chest, listening to his heartbeat as she sorted through her feelings. What she felt for Ryan wasn't what she'd felt for George, that youthful, idealistic love of first romance. This was something different, deeper in some ways, more grounded in the reality of who they were now. Two people who had weathered life's hardships and still found reasons to hope. "I think I could," she whispered finally. "Love again." Ryan's arms tightened around her, and they remained that way until sleep claimed them both. Morning brought clarity in more ways than one. The storm had passed, leaving a washed clean sky and waterlogged land. Together, Clara and Ryan surveyed the damage. The creek had indeed overflowed its banks, but Ryan's irrigation channels had performed as intended, diverting the worst of the flooding away from their wheat. There was damage, perhaps a quarter of the field lay under muddy water, but the majority of their crop still stood. "It could have been much worse," Ryan observed, his hand resting at the small of Clara's back. "Thanks to your foresight with those channels," she acknowledged. As they walked back toward the cabin, the practical realities of their situation reasserted themselves. Ryan couldn't simply move into Clara's home, not without causing the kind of scandal that could damage both their reputations. Yet the thought of returning to their previous arrangement, with Ryan riding back to town each evening, seemed impossible after what they'd shared. "I should go into town today," Ryan said as they approached the cabin. "People will be wondering where I am after the storm." Clara nodded, trying to mask her disappointment. "Of course." Ryan turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "I meant what I said last night, Clara. I love you. That changes everything for me." Clara squeezed his hands. "For me as well." "I need to finish the paperwork on the Matthews place," Ryan continued. "Then we need to decide what happens next." "What do you want to happen?" Clara asked, her heart racing. Ryan's gaze was steady, unwavering. "I want to marry you if you'll have me. Combine our lands, our lives." Build something together. The directness of his proposal took Clara's breath away. Ryan, we've known each other barely 2 months, and in those 2 months I've learned everything I need to know about you, he countered. You're strong, determined, kind. You face each day with courage, no matter what it brings. I'd be proud to call you my wife. Clara felt tears welling in her eyes. The town calls me Barren, she said, voicing the fear that had lurked beneath the surface. You should know George and I tried for years to have children. It never happened. Ryan's expression softened. Clara, I'm not asking you to give me children. I'm asking you to give me a life with you in it. That's enough. But no buts, he interrupted gently. Some people have a dozen children and still die alone and bitter. Others have none and build a life full of love and purpose. I know which I'd choose. Clara studied his face, looking for any hint of reservation or doubt. She found none. You're certain. More certain than I've been about anything, Ryan affirmed. But I don't need your answer today. Think on it while I'm in town. I'll come back tomorrow. After he left, Clara moved through her day in a daze, her body still humming with the memory of his touch, her mind racing with possibilities she'd long since abandoned. Marriage, a partner, a future that wasn't just about survival. Could she trust this unexpected chance at happiness? George had been gone 3 years long enough that remarrying wouldn't dishonor his memory. And Ryan wasn't asking her to forget her first husband, only to make room in her heart for a second love. As for children, Clara pressed a hand to her flat stomach. The town's whispers had branded her barren, but no doctor had ever confirmed it. Perhaps with Ryan, things would be different, or perhaps not. Either way, he seemed sincere in his assertion that children weren't his priority. By evening, Clara had reached a decision. She would accept Ryan's proposal not out of desperation or loneliness, but because in him she'd found someone who saw her true value. Not as a potential mother, not as a piece of property, but as a woman of worth in her own right. The next morning, Clara woke early and dressed with care, pinning her hair in a more flattering style than her usual practical bun. She was hanging fresh curtains, a task she'd been putting off for months, when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Ryan appeared more quickly than she'd expected, but as she stepped onto the porch to greet him, she realized something was wrong. He rode fast, his expression grim, and he wasn't alone. Sheriff Patterson followed close behind. Clara, Ryan called as he dismounted, striding toward her with urgency. We need to talk. What's happened? She asked, alarm rising as she noted the tension in both men's faces. Ryan glanced at the sheriff, who nodded grimly. Tell her. There's a man in town, Ryan began, his voice tight. Arrived yesterday during the storm, says his name is Elias Blackwood. Clara frowned, the name unfamiliar. What does that have to do with us? He's claiming to own this land, Ryan said bluntly. Says he bought it from George before he died, but the deed was lost. He's got a witness who backs his story, says they were present when George signed over the property. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. George would never sell our land. Never. Sheriff Patterson stepped forward. Mrs. Zimmerman, I don't like this any more than you do, but Blackwood's got papers, not a deed, but a contract of sale, and his witness is Gordon Miller. Clara's stomach dropped. Gordon Miller had been George's friend, a man who'd helped them build their first lean-to before the cabin was complete. He'd moved to California years ago, or so everyone had thought. It's a lie, she insisted. George never sold this land. I would have known. Blackwood claims George kept it from you because he knew you'd be upset, the sheriff explained, discomfort evident in his stance. Says George was planning to move you both to Oregon, start fresh. Clara shook her head vehemently. No, George loved this land. We both did. This was our dream. Ryan's jaw was tight with barely contained anger. I don't believe it either, Clara. but Blackwood's talking about filing a legal claim. Says he's been trying to find you for 2 years to inform you that your residency here is unauthorized. This is my home, Clara whispered, shock giving way to a cold fury. My husband died here. I've worked this land for 7 years. How dare this stranger? Will fight it, Ryan interrupted, his hand finding hers. I've already sent for a lawyer from Helena. Should be here within the week. Sheriff Patterson cleared his throat. In the meantime, Mrs. Zimmerman, I'd advise you to gather any papers your husband might have left, letters, documents, anything that might disprove Blackwood's claim. Clara nodded numbly, her mind racing. George had kept a metal box with important papers. She'd rarely had reason to open it after his death, assuming it contained only the deed to their land and what little money he'd managed to save. After the men left, Ryan promising to return by nightfall, Clara retrieved the box from beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. Inside, she found the deed to the homestead, bearing both her and George's names. There were also several letters from George's family back east, a small pouch containing gold coins she hadn't known existed, and a folded piece of paper she didn't recognize. With trembling fingers, Clara unfolded the document. It was a letter, dated just weeks before George's death, addressed to her but never delivered. My dearest Clara, it began in George's familiar handwriting. If you are reading this, I fear the worst has happened. The cough worsens daily, and I see the worry in your eyes though you try to hide it. Tears blurred Clara's vision as she continued reading. I must confess something I've kept from you. Last month, a man named Blackwood approached me with an offer to buy our land. He was persistent, offering far more than the property is worth. When I refused, his manner turned threatening. He suggested accidents befall stubborn homesteaders all the time. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, shock and horror washing through her. I've told Miller about this, George's letter continued. If anything happens to me that seems unnatural, look to Blackwood. I've hidden this letter and some gold I've saved over the years. Use it if you need to flee or to fight for what is ours. The letter continued with expressions of love and regret for dreams they might not realize together. By the time Clara finished reading, her tears had dried, replaced by a cold determination. Blackwood hadn't just come to steal her land, he might have had something to do with George's death. The timing of George's illness, coming so soon after this threatening encounter, suddenly seemed suspicious. Could Blackwood have somehow poisoned George, making it appear as pneumonia? The possibility was too terrible to contemplate, yet Clara couldn't dismiss it. She carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the box, along with the deed and gold. This evidence would be crucial in fighting Blackwood's fraudulent claim. Ryan returned as promised that evening, bringing troubling news. Blackwood's taken a room at the hotel, he reported as they sat at Clara's table. He's been talking all over town, saying George sold him the land because he knew you couldn't manage it alone if anything happened to him. Clara's hands clenched into fists. I found something today, she said, retrieving George's letter and showing it to Ryan. As he read, Ryan's expression darkened. This changes everything, he said finally. This isn't just about a land dispute. If what George suspected is true, Blackwood might have had a hand in his death. How do we prove it? Clara asked. George's illness seemed natural enough. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia. There are ways to make poison mimic natural illness, Ryan said grimly. I've seen it happen. Clara studied him with new awareness. You're not just a rancher, are you? Ryan hesitated before answering. I worked as a deputy marshal for a few years before returning to ranching. Saw some ugly things: land fraud, murder disguised as accident or illness. Why didn't you tell me? Because I left that life behind, Ryan explained. Too much violence, too much ugliness. Wanted something different. Clara absorbed this revelation, finding it explained much about Ryan's confidence and capability. "Will your experience help us now?" "It might," Ryan acknowledged. "Blackwood doesn't know I have any law background." That could work to our advantage. Over the next days, they formulated a plan. Ryan would continue with his purchase of the Matthews property as a cover while quietly investigating Blackwood's background. Clara would maintain her routine, giving no indication she knew of Blackwood's claim or George's suspicions. Meanwhile, they waited for the lawyer Ryan had summoned from Helena, hoping he would arrive before Blackwood could formalize his fraudulent claim. 4 days later, Blackwood himself rode out to Clara's homestead. She was working in her vegetable garden when he arrived, a tall man with sharp features and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in Promise Creek. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he called, dismounting with a flourish. "A pleasure to finally meet you." Clara straightened, wiping soil from her hands as she assessed the man who threatened everything she had. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume." "Indeed," he confirmed with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "I've been looking forward to seeing this property again." "Your husband spoke so highly of the improvements you'd made together." "Did he?" Clara replied, keeping her voice neutral despite the rage simmering beneath the surface. "How interesting, since my husband never mentioned you to me." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "George wanted to surprise you with our arrangement. He thought a fresh start in Oregon would revitalize your spirits after your disappointments." The reference to her childlessness was thinly veiled, clearly meant to wound. Clara refused to show how deeply it struck. "My husband and I had no disappointments here," she said firmly. "This land was everything we wanted." Blackwood shrugged elegantly. "Perhaps he didn't share all his thoughts with you. Men often shield their wives from worries. Why have you waited so long to claim this land?" Clara asked, changing tactics. "George has been dead 3 years. Business abroad," Blackwood replied smoothly. "I only recently returned to find my property still occupied. I've been most patient, Mrs. Zimmerman, but now I must insist you make arrangements to vacate. I'm prepared to give you 30 days, out of respect for your situation." Clara fought to maintain her composure. "I'll need to see proof of your claim before I consider any such action." "Of course," Blackwood agreed with false graciousness. "I've filed the necessary papers with the county clerk. The sheriff will be delivering official notice shortly." He glanced around the homestead, his gaze calculating. "I see you've let the north field go fallow until recently. Wise decision to bring in help, though I fear Mr. Xavier's efforts will benefit me rather than you." The casual mention of Ryan sent a chill through Clara. Blackwood had been watching, gathering information. "Mr. Xavier is a neighbor helping a neighbor," she said carefully. "Nothing more." Blackwood's smile turned knowing. "Is that so? Town gossip suggests otherwise." Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Ryan's arrival. He rode in with purposeful speed, his expression hardening at the sight of Blackwood. "Clara," Ryan called, dismounting and moving to stand beside her. "Everything all right here?" "Perfectly civil," Blackwood interjected before Clara could answer. "Just introducing myself to Mrs. Zimmerman and explaining the unfortunate situation." Ryan's stance was protective as he addressed Blackwood. "The only unfortunate situation is a stranger appearing with dubious claims to land that's been legally homesteaded for years." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "I understand you're purchasing the Matthews place, Mr. Xavier. I suggest you focus on your own affairs rather than involving yourself in matters that don't concern you." "Clara's welfare concerns me greatly," Ryan replied, his voice deceptively calm. "As does justice." A tense silence stretched between the men, broken finally by Blackwood's cold laugh. "How noble! Well, I won't intrude further today. Mrs. Zimmerman expect formal notice within the week." With a tip of his hat, he mounted his horse and rode away. As soon as he was out of earshot, Clara turned to Ryan. "He knows about us," she said urgently. "The town's been talking." "Let them talk," Ryan replied, though his expression was troubled. "More importantly, the lawyer arrived from Helena this morning. He's reviewing George's letter and the deed now. What does he think of our chances?" "He believes we have a strong case," Ryan assured her. "George's letter clearly establishes that no sale was agreed to, and the deed bearing both your names gives you clear legal standing." Clara nodded, though worry still gnawed at her. "Blackwood seems very confident." "Men like him always do," Ryan said grimly. "I've been asking around about him. He has a reputation for acquiring properties through questionable means, always targeting vulnerable homesteaders, often widows or elderly farmers." "And Gordon Miller? Why would George's friend lie for him?" Ryan's expression darkened. "Money, most likely, or threats. I'm still trying to locate Miller to question him directly." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The encounter with Blackwood had left her shaken, his confidence in his claim disturbing despite the evidence against him. When dawn finally broke, she rose exhausted but determined. Ryan arrived early, accompanied by a distinguished older man Clara recognized as the lawyer from Helena, James Harrington. "Mrs. Zimmerman," Harrington greeted her formally. "I've reviewed your husband's letter and the deed to this property. Based on these documents, I believe Mr. Blackwood's claim is fraudulent. However, I must warn you that these cases can become complicated." "What do you suggest?" Clara asked, gesturing for both men to sit at her table. "We file a counterclaim immediately," Harrington advised. "And perhaps more importantly, we investigate Gordon Miller's testimony. If we can prove he's lying, Blackwood's case collapses." Ryan leaned forward. "I've located Miller. He's staying at Blackwood's hotel, rarely leaves his room, appears to be drinking heavily." Harrington nodded thoughtfully. "A guilty conscience, perhaps, if we could get him alone, away from Blackwood's influence." "I have an idea," Clara said suddenly. "Gordon was always fond of my apple pie, said it reminded him of his mother's. What if I were to bring him one as a gesture of old friendship? It might give me a chance to speak with him privately." Ryan frowned. "Too dangerous. Blackwood wouldn't let you near Miller without supervision." "Not if he doesn't know I'm there," Clara countered. "I could go to town tomorrow for supplies as I normally would. No one would question me visiting the hotel kitchen to deliver a pie to an old friend." After much discussion, they refined the plan. Clara would indeed visit Miller, but Ryan would ensure he was positioned nearby in case of trouble. Harrington would prepare legal papers to file immediately if they secured evidence of Miller's false testimony. The next day, Clara drove to town with an apple pie carefully packed beside her. She completed her errands at the mercantile as usual, then made her way to the hotel. Through discreet inquiry, she learned Miller was indeed in his room, having taken his meals there since arrival. Clara approached the hotel kitchen, where she knew the cook, Mrs. Larson, from church gatherings. "Clara Zimmerman, what brings you here?" Mrs. Larson asked, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "I heard Gordon Miller is staying here," Clara explained, displaying her pie. "He was a friend of George's. Thought I'd welcome him back to town." Mrs. Larson's expression grew sympathetic. "You haven't heard, then, about his claim that your husband sold your land?" "What?" Clara feigned shock and dismay. "That can't be right. Gordon was George's friend." "That's what everyone's saying," Mrs. Larson confirmed, lowering her voice. "Though between us, Miller looks terrible thin as a rail and drinking from morning till night. Doesn't seem right proud of himself, if you ask me." This confirmed what Ryan had discovered. "I still want to see him," Clara insisted. "Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." Mrs. Larson hesitated, then nodded. "He's in room 4 upstairs, but Mr. Blackwood left strict instructions not to disturb them." "Is Blackwood with him now?" "No, he's at the land office," Mrs. Larson replied. "Should be gone another hour at least." This was exactly what Clara had hoped for. "I'll just run up quickly then. Thank you, Mrs. Larson." Clara climbed the hotel stairs, her heart pounding. Outside room 4, she paused, gathering her courage before knocking softly. "Go away," came a slurred voice from within. "Told you I don't want anything." "Gordon," Clara called quietly. "It's Clara Zimmerman. I've brought you pie." A long silence followed, then shuffling footsteps approached the door. It opened to reveal a man Clara barely recognized. Gordon Miller had once been robust and jovial. The man before her was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling. "Clara," he breathed, shame washing over his features. "You shouldn't be here." "May I come in?" she asked gently. Gordon glanced nervously down the hallway before stepping aside. The room smelled of whiskey and unwashed bodies, clothes strewn about, empty bottles littering surfaces. "I know what you've told Blackwood," Clara said without preamble, setting the pie on a table. "About George selling him our land." Gordon flinched, unable to meet her eyes. "You don't understand. I had no choice." "There's always a choice, Gordon," Clara replied, her voice firm but kind. "George was your friend. He trusted you." Gordon sank onto the bed, burying his face in his hands. "Blackwood owns me, Clara. I owe him more money than I'll ever see in my lifetime. Gambling debts. He said he'd forgive it all if I backed his story." "So you lied," Clara stated flatly. Gordon nodded miserably. "I never thought he'd actually find you. Told myself it was a harmless lie since George was already gone and you'd moved on somewhere else." Clara sat beside him, her voice low and urgent. "Gordon, I know what Blackwood did. George left me a letter. He suspected Blackwood might have had something to do with his death." Gordon's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes wide with horror. "What?" "Blackwood threatened George when he wouldn't sell," Clara explained. "And shortly after, George fell ill. Too coincidental, don't you think?" Gordon began to tremble more violently. "Oh God! Oh God, Clara, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "Know what, Gordon?" Clara pressed, sensing she was close to something important. "Blackwood gave me something," Gordon whispered, his voice barely audible. "Said to put it in George's coffee when I visited. Said it would just make him sick enough to reconsider selling. I never thought, never dreamed." Clara felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her. "You poisoned my husband, not to kill him," Gordon protested, tears streaming down his face. "Just to make him ill for a few days. Blackwood said it was harmless, would cause some coughing, weakness, make George realize he needed money for a fresh start. I swear, Clara, I didn't know it would kill him." Clara's mind reeled with this confession. Gordon hadn't just lied about a land sale, he'd been an unwitting accomplice to George's murder. "You need to tell the sheriff," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "You need to make this right, Gordon." "Blackwood will kill me," Gordon moaned. "You don't know what he's capable of." "I know exactly what he's capable of," Clara replied coldly. "He murdered my husband and now wants to steal my home, but he'll only succeed if good men do nothing." Gordon stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "All right," he whispered. "I'll tell the truth. God help me, but I'll tell the truth." Clara had just secured Gordon's promise to accompany her to the sheriff's office when the door burst open. Blackwood stood in the doorway, his face contorted with rage. "How touching," he sneered. "A reunion of old friends." Clara rose to her feet, fear coursing through her veins even as she struggled to maintain her composure. "Mr. Blackwood, I was just leaving." "I think not," Blackwood replied, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. From his coat he withdrew a pistol. "Not after what I just heard." Gordon cowered on the bed, his momentary courage evaporating at the sight of the weapon. "Elias, please. I didn't tell her anything." "Liar," Blackwood spat. "You've always been a pitiful liar, Miller. It's why I had to script your testimony so carefully." His cold gaze shifted to Clara. "Mrs. Zimmerman, this is most unfortunate. I had hoped to resolve our property dispute amicably." "By amicably, you mean stealing my land after murdering my husband," Clara replied, surprising herself with her steady voice despite her racing heart. Blackwood's lips curved in a mirthless smile. "Such accusations! Who would believe you? A desperate widow about to lose her home making wild claims against a respected businessman." "The sheriff might," came Ryan's voice from the doorway, which Blackwood had failed to fully close. He stood with his gun already drawn, aimed steadily at Blackwood. As might a former deputy marshal. Blackwood's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of surprise in his otherwise composed demeanor. "Mr. Xavier, how convenient that you happen to be passing by." "Not convenience." "Planning," Ryan corrected. Clara was never alone. From the hallway behind Ryan appeared Sheriff Patterson and James Harrington, both with expressions of grim determination. "We heard everything, Blackwood," the sheriff said. "Gordon's confession, your threats, it's over." For a tense moment, Blackwood seemed to consider his options, his grip on his pistol tightening. Then, with surprising quickness, he grabbed Clara, pulling her against him as a shield, the gun pressed to her temple. "I think not," Blackwood hissed. "You'll let me leave with Mrs. Zimmerman as my insurance. Once I'm safely away, I'll release her." Clara's eyes met Ryan's across the room. In that moment of silent communication, she understood what she needed to do. As Ryan's gaze flickered briefly to her feet, Clara remembered their conversations about self-defense, how a sharp backward kick to the shin could momentarily distract an attacker. "No one needs to get hurt," Sheriff Patterson was saying, trying to de-escalate the situation. Clara drew a deep breath, then slammed her heel down onto Blackwood's foot with all her strength while simultaneously driving her elbow into his ribs. His grip loosened just enough for her to duck away as Ryan fired, the bullet striking Blackwood's shoulder. Blackwood staggered backward, his own shot going wild into the ceiling as he fell. Sheriff Patterson rushed forward, kicking Blackwood's gun away and securing him despite his pained protests. Clara found herself enveloped in Ryan's arms, her body trembling with delayed shock and relief. "You were magnificent," Ryan murmured against her hair. "Brave and brilliant." Over the next days, the full story emerged. Gordon Miller, racked with guilt and no longer under Blackwood's influence, provided a complete confession. He described how Blackwood had supplied him with a powder to put in George's coffee, supposedly just to make him ill enough to reconsider selling. But in reality, a slow-acting poison that mimicked pneumonia symptoms. Blackwood was charged with George's murder, and attempted murder of Clara, along with numerous counts of fraud related to similar land schemes across 3 territories. The evidence against him was overwhelming, his previous victims coming forward once word spread of his arrest. As summer progressed into early fall, life in Promise Creek gradually returned to normal. The wheat in Clara's north field, minus the portion damaged by flooding, grew tall and golden under the Montana sun. Ryan completed his purchase of the Matthews property and began making improvements, though he spent most evenings at Clara's homestead. Their relationship, no longer hidden, became the subject of approving rather than scandalous gossip. In the face of all they'd endured together, the town's earlier whispers about Clara being barren and dust faded away, replaced by admiration for her courage and resilience. One evening in late September, as they sat on Clara's porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Ryan took her hand. "I asked you a question before all this trouble began," he reminded her softly. "About building a life together." Clara turned to him, her heart full. "You did." "My offer stands," Ryan said, his blue eyes earnest. "More than stands, I'm more certain than ever that you're the woman I want to spend my life with." Clara smiled, squeezing his hand. "And I've had time to consider my answer." "Which is?" Ryan prompted when she paused. "Yes," Clara said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Ryan Xavier." The joy that transformed his face was worth every hardship she'd endured. As he gathered her into his arms, Clara felt a sense of rightness, of coming home in a way that had nothing to do with land or property. They were married 2 weeks later in Promise Creek's small church, the same one where Clara had once mourned George. The irony wasn't lost on her, but there was healing in it, to a sense that life's circle continued, bringing new beginnings from endings. Ryan sold the Matthews property, using the profits to expand and improve Clara's homestead, their homestead now. Together they built a larger barn, purchased cattle and horses, and hired hands to work the expanded fields. Winter came, bringing snow that blanketed the land in pristine white. Inside their cabin, warmed by the fireplace George had built and the love Ryan had brought back into her life, Clara felt a contentment she'd feared lost forever. One snowy evening, as they sat before the fire, Clara turned to her husband with news she'd been confirming for several weeks. "Ryan," she began, her voice soft with wonder, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the book he'd been reading, his expression curious. "What is it?" Clara took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "It seems the town was wrong about me being barren," she said, her eyes shining. "We're going to have a child." Ryan's face transformed with astonishment and then pure joy. "A child," he repeated, as if unable to believe what he'd heard. "You're certain?" Clara nodded, tears of happiness spilling onto her cheeks. "Dr. Mitchell confirmed it yesterday. He says I'm about 3 months along. The baby should arrive in late spring." Ryan gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of the most precious material on earth. "Clara Xavier," he whispered against her hair, "do you have any idea how much I love you?" "I think I do," she replied, nestling against him. "About as much as I love you." As snow fell softly outside their window, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. They had called her Barren and Dust, names meant to diminish and dismiss her. But Ryan had seen her differently from the beginning, had called her gold when others saw only worthlessness, had valued her strength when others pitied her solitude. And now, against all expectations, she carried their future within her. A child who would grow up knowing the story of the homestead, of George's dream and Clara's perseverance, of Ryan's love that had rebuilt what grief had broken. Outside, the Montana winter worked its magic, covering old scars in the land with new snow promising spring's renewal beneath the frozen surface. Inside, wrapped in Ryan's arms before the fire George had built, Clara closed her eyes and gave thanks for second chances, for love found when least expected, and for the future growing within her, proof that life, like the stubborn prairie grasses that survived drought and flood, always found a way to flourish again. By the time their son was born, a healthy boy they named George Ryan Xavier, the wheat in their north field stood tall and golden once more, a testament to what could grow from land others had dismissed as mere dust. And as Ryan placed their newborn son in Clara's arms, his eyes shining with pride and love, she knew that the whispers had been wrong. She wasn't barren or dust. She was exactly what Ryan had always called her: gold, precious, enduring and worth every struggle it took to find her. 5 years later, Clara stood on the porch of their expanded homestead, watching Ryan teaching their son to ride his first pony while their 3-year-old daughter, Hope, played with wooden blocks nearby. The homestead had flourished under their joint care, becoming one of the most prosperous in the county. "Mama, look," George called, sitting proudly atop the gentle pony as Ryan led it around the corral. "I'm riding like Papa. I see you, sweetheart." Clara called back, her heart full as she observed Ryan's patient guidance, the same gentle strength he'd shown her when he'd first offered to fix her wagon wheel all those years ago. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant golds and reds, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From widow to wife, from Barren to mother, from surviving to thriving, each step had seemed impossible until she'd taken it, often with Ryan's hand steadying her. The homestead that had once been called dust now bloomed with life and possibility, just as Clara herself had. And as Ryan looked up from their son's riding lesson to meet her gaze across the distance, his smile warm with the promise of the evening to come, Clara knew with absolute certainty that this love, this family, this life they'd built together was worth every hardship she'd endured. In Ryan's eyes, she had never been barren or dust. He had seen the gold within her when she'd forgotten it existed. And together, they had created a future more precious than either could have imagined alone.